Hello everyone, my name is Tessa. I'm using text-to-speech to explain what is on our screen right now. You are looking at a Python program that integrates ChatGPT API. In this video we are going to see if ChatGPT API understand where it's running on. We are using Raspberry Pi 5, and we set the initial prompt to ChatGPT API to let it know. Now, we are going to ask if ChatGPT API knows how many GPIO pins it has, before asking it to program itself. The purpose of this test is to understand how much does ChatGPT API knows about the Raspberry Pi 5 and how to give a physical output through the GPIO pins. Later on, we will attach some LEDs on the GPIO pins and do more tests without intermediary API, like Robot API or JSON. As you can see on the screen, ChatGPT API have the knowledge of how many pins it has. Now, we are going to test if the ChatGPT API knows which pins are in use and to what component. Spoiler alert, we haven't attached any components to the Raspberry Pi 5 yet. The ChatGPT API thinks that there are 4 pins in use on the Raspberry Pi 5. This answer is incorrect, which shows that ChatGPT API might hallucinate. It could run into some serious issues and unsafe if we rely entirely on ChatGPT API to generate code to move servo motors or any physical component. Now, we are going to attach some LEDs to the Raspberry Pi 5. We have 3 LEDs, red to pin 17, green to pin 27, and yellow to pin 22. We are going to see if the ChatGPT API could turn on the LEDs by generating a Python code that will run automatically. For the purpose of this test, we still haven't given the ChatGPT API any intermediary API, like Robot API or JSON, to help it interpret the instruction. So, we need to tell ChatGPT API exactly which pins are the LEDs attached to, as well as specify the colors of the LEDs in the instruction. For example, we tell the ChatGPT API to turn on the red LEDs on pin 17 and yellow LEDs on pin 27. ChatGPT API fails to complete the instruction. Let's try again. We keep giving it the same prompt to understand how many attempts needed until ChatGPT API successfully completed the instruction given. As you can see on the screen, ChatGPT API is able to program itself and complete the instruction. But the LEDs only turn on for a second, before they are off again. Before seeing the footage, we thought ChatGPT API failed. So, we checked on the code generated by ChatGPT API and checked on our main Python program to make sure that the codes are correct. We noticed that we haven't input all the GPIO pins the LEDs are connected to. So, we made some adjustments before proceeding with the test again. In the footage, we are trying to figure out what's wrong. We didn't know that ChatGPT API had already completed the instruction. We didn't realize that the code generated by ChatGPT API is making the LEDs to turn on only for 1 second. This shows us that relying solely on codes generated by ChatGPT API, the run it automatically, might risk some hardware problems, if not sanitized or supervised by human. Without giving it intermediary API or JSON, we give a little clue in our main Python code, the GPIO pins, and the colors of the LEDs. We do this so we can see if the ChatGPT API is able to access the main code or not. We stop the program and try again. Since we have made some adjustments and give a little clue in our main Python code, we give instruction to ChatGPT API by telling it to turn on yellow and red LEDs. But the ChatGPT API failed to complete the instruction. This means that ChatGPT API cannot access the main Python code despite our attempt to make descriptive variables. Therefore, we proceed the test with detail instructions. For example, turn on the green LEDs on pin 27 and yellow LEDs on pin 22. It fails, so we have to try again with the same detail instruction. It successfully turned on the yellow LEDs on pin 22, but the green LEDs on pin 27 is still off. There is a possibility that the green LEDs is faulty. So we try again with the same format of instruction to turn on and turn off another LEDs that are connected to the Raspberry Pi 5. We instruct ChatGPT API to turn on the red LEDs on pin 17. And it successfully completed the instruction without turning off the yellow LEDs on pin 22 that's still on. We instruct ChatGPT API to turn off the yellow LEDs on pin 22. It takes a lot of failed attempt from the ChatGPT API to complete the instruction. And finally, the ChatGPT API could turn off the yellow LEDs without turning off the red LEDs. Then, we instruct ChatGPT API to turn off the red LEDs on pin 17. ChatGPT API successfully complete the instruction without turning on any other LEDs. Now, we're asking if the ChatGPT API knows which pins are currently in use on Raspberry Pi 5. Because there are no intermediary API or JSON, the ChatGPT API doesn't fully know which pins are currently in use. In the code generated by ChatGPT API, there are only 5 pins currently in use: pin 2, pin 3, pin 4, pin 17, and pin 27. Now, we ask if ChatGPT API knows how many pins does the Raspberry Pi 5, the device it's running on, has. And for some reason, the ChatGPT API said it has 0 pins. We ask it again to test the ChatGPT API knowledge about Raspberry Pi 5. After a few errors, the ChatGPT API finally answers correctly. There are 54 pins on Raspberry Pi 5. Let's test again. We ask ChatGPT API, how many pins are currently in use? Unfortunately, ChatGPT API still doesn't know, and have no access, to know which pins on Raspberry Pi 5 are currently in use. It only gives us how many pins in Raspberry Pi 5, but no understanding of how many pins are currently in use. In the next test, we are going to give an intermediary API or JSON file to help ChatGPT API understand the device it's running on and execute the instruction we give. Previously, because there are no intermediary API or JSON, the ChatGPT API needs a few failed attempts to finally complete the instruction.